Okay,
Awesome.
we're great.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Everybody, thank you for bearing with us regarding these technical difficulties. But
Yeah.
we are ready to move forward now. Next slide, please. What we are hoping that you will learn in this workshop, but what I do want to say is in these workshops with Grow NYC and particularly with Gardens at Nature, we are all facilitators in this space. Chantel and I by no means proclaim to be experts because we don't actually believe in the word expert. We believe that everybody brings something to the space. So we absolutely invite you to please be co-curators and co-facilitators with us. But it is our intention that you will learn in this workshop about winterizing your garden. Planning and preparation is very important. My aunt used to tell me that those who fail to plan, plan to fail. So we're going to go over some really essential aspects of what we hope you will be considering and thinking about in your planning for winter. We're going to talk about season extension, the pros and the cons of high tunnels, cold frames, and greenhouses. Chantal and I are both beekeepers. We're going to talk about a subject that to us isn't spoken about enough. For those of you that might have access to bees or hives on your spaces or in your spaces, we're going to talk a little bit about winterizing. We're also going to do a nod to what to do after the harvest. When your season ends and you've collected all of this wonderful produce and fruit, what do you do? Chantal and I are both chefs in our own right. We like to eat, we like to preserve. We're going to talk about springing forward. I hate to rush the calendar, but before we know it, the snow melts and the cold thaws, and it's time to jump right back into spring. One of the most important things that we're going to talk about today is rest. And that is something I know for sure that as growers, we are not talking about enough. As we always like to, we are going to provide you with a bevy of resources. And we do remind you that the conversation never stops here. We will also have our contact information so that you may contact us after the program to keep the conversation going. Next slide, please. Before we get started, Chantel and I always like to establish some boundaries in the space. And it is important for you to know that by showing up in this virtual space, you inherently agree to these community agreements as we also agree to them by being in this space with you. Some of you may be aware, aware of community agreements, and some of these might look familiar to you. For those who might not be aware, community agreements are just simply guidelines that we all agree to follow so that our space is free, safe, liberated, and inclusive. Regardless of all or any community agreement, cultural, regional, we always start off with the granddaddy of community agreements that applies to every programming, in person or otherwise. Respect comes first. We might not agree with each other, but we must respect each other. When it comes to respecting each other, Chantel and I practice one mic, make space, take space. You're going to see in this program that Chantel and I have pretty robust personalities. And for that reason, we like to pass the mic and pass our platform to those who maybe don't have that opportunity to share their thoughts. And we encourage anyone who maybe might be a little shy or introverted, if you would like to mic or if you would like to show up in the chat, we definitely encourage that. We like to meet people where they are. We understand that 5 p.m. on a Tuesday, when it's rather nice outside, is a tough ask for people to come. And we thank you so much for joining us today. And we receive you whether your video is on or off, whether you're muted or not. We encourage you to show up in the chat if you are able, but we completely understand if it just took all that you had to just click the Zoom link and be here. And we thank you for that. Please always allow for learning moments. It's important to remember that because of different cultural experiences and backgrounds and education, we might all be at different walks of life. Please have grace and be patient for someone who might be in the room that's just learning and might have some questions. It's a learning opportunity for you to kind of remember when you first started, and please be patient and let folks learn. Intention versus impact is always important. Please understand that while you may have the best intention with what you are speaking, be mindful of the lasting impact it might have on someone. It might not have been your intention to hurt their feelings, but it did. So let's please always understand that the impact is lasting, even though the intention might be fleeting. We practice respond to receive, not retaliate. Please actively listen and give someone a chance to communicate what they are trying to say. Start from the premise that they really didn't show up here today to offend anyone. They didn't wake up saying, hey, I think I'll attend a Grow NYC workshop on preparing for winter, and I think I'll piss someone off. Please be patient. And when you go to answer, please listen intentionally and speak kindly. Sometimes people just make a mistake. Please always use I statements and respond from your own experience. Please shy away from sweeping generalizations and assumptions, because again, we all have different levels of experience and we're coming from different places. Shout out in the chat for us. Thank you so much, everyone who's letting us know where you're from, what garden you're at. Shout out in the chat for us what community agreements land with you, and perhaps some that you would like for us to add to this agreement as we continue our programming for the rest of the season. Next slide, please. Winterizing 101. That's why you're here. Let's jump into it. So before we get deeply into what it takes or even just what it means to winterize, let's stop for a second and in your mind, and if you would like to share in the chat, that's fine too. Think about all of the bullet points that we have on this slide. Think about where you are right now. Some of you might be feeling a little overwhelmed, and by some of you, I mean me, by where we may be or not be in our garden season. Some of you might be feeling, I'm behind. I should have started winterizing a couple of months ago. Some of you might be feeling, I'm not even close to even finishing my season. Crops and herbs and fruits are still growing and people are still harvesting. We're here to tell you all of the above is okay. But we would like for everyone to just take a moment to think about, how did your season go this season? Was it a great season? Was it a not so great season? And why? What are those standout points? What are those wins that you celebrated either individually or collectively as community? Chantel and I celebrate all wins here. If one apple grew right, it's a win. What are some of your losses? Did anybody experiment this season? In one of the growing spaces that I was in this season, we did an experiment. We actually very successfully grew rice in the Bronx. We grew a Russian variety, and it was quite a challenge because with the microclimates we were experiencing, and we'll talk about the impact of microclimates, we experienced a lot of rain, whereas friends in Brooklyn experienced tremendous drought. But our experiment of growing rice was fairly successful for our first time. What was the intention of your growing season, and what was the impact? What did you start out wanting to do, and how did it land with the community? How was your pest management this season? Because of the AQI, that stands for air quality impact, did you see a rise in pets in your gardens? Did you see a decline? And what kinds of pests did you see? How were your yields? If you were producing for a community in lieu of climate, what did your yields look like? Were they less than they were last season? Or did you have quite an abundance? Lastly, what was your programming and engagement? What did that look like? Did you exceed expectations? Were you a little disappointed? Or were you not focused on programming and engagement because you wanted to focus on your production? If you feel inclined, if none of these hit you or if all of these hit you, if there's something on the list that we did include that is your focus while we're assessing your season, we invite you to go ahead and shout that out in the chat for us. Next slide, please. We're going to kick off with climate change because it's at the forefront of our minds. And from the input that we've received from community members, it's at the forefront of a lot of people's minds. Climate change is inevitable. It's happening across the world and has been for quite some time. And we're finding ourselves more and more just frankly trying to not only understand weather patterns, but thinking about what are we going to do? Parameters indicate that they're going to become a larger issue, to say the least. And as growers or aspiring growers, it's important for us to understand what climate change means in our community. I just shared that in one of the spaces that I steward in the Bronx, we grew rice. Rice is typically grown in a USDA zone of maybe 10 to 12, excuse me. And with New York State being a zone of 7A to 7B, this was pretty tremendous. To give you some perspective for those who might not be aware, rice is typically grown in South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and Alabama, traditionally hot states. So for us to have the capacity to grow rice in the Bronx nods to a very significant shift in weather and climate. When we talk about preparing for winter and we talk about thinking about your garden space, observation is key. What kind of microclimates did your space experience? And by microclimates, I mean, if the larger climate suggests that today is sunny, did the Bronx experience tremendous drought? Or did Brooklyn experience tremendous rain? That just means, do we have smaller systems moving across the 5 boroughs? And we did, actually. How did they affect your spaces? Because how these microclimates are moving are eventually going to affect how we seed, what we plant, and the possibility of what we can grow. For the first time that I can remember, many of the spaces that Chantel and I stewarded this season were tremendously affected by the air quality index. I apologize, I said air quality impact earlier. To me, same thing, because it impacted us very greatly. I am asthmatic and I am severely allergic. And honestly, there were some days where I couldn't even make it out the house because the air quality was so bad. If you are not already, we encourage you to always check the air quality index. That can be done on the Weather Channel and various apps that are available on your phone. And the air quality index is simply used to tell us the level of debris or pollution. I'm actually going to shy away from the word clean because that's a very loaded word when it comes to air quality, especially when it comes to emissions in the tri-state area. So I'm going to just say it tells us the level of debris, emissions, and pollution and how they might be impacting our air and definitely how it might affect our health. How did your plants respond? When the air quality index first started to really, really be troublesome, I reached out to a trusted ally and resource at Cornell Extension. And he was able to help me understand that the air quality index actually was affecting people more than it was the plants. And that was because he said that the plants, as well as the bees, are already adjusting to changes in environment. And he started to share how advanced they actually are, and it's us that have to catch up. He also shared that thankfully, most of the challenges with the air quality this season were smoke from maple trees. So this was actually natural, especially for bees and for plants. And he also shared, lastly, that the air quality index, while it was troublesome for us, it wasn't nearly at the height of what it could have been to actually impair plants and herbs in the garden. We keep bringing up rain because rain was a very significant issue this season. How did rain impact your space? Did you conserve water? Did you have rain barrels? How did you respond if you were experiencing drought? And do those of you who have bioswales, rainwater barrels, did you have overflow? Did they work even? Because for some spaces, if you're experiencing drought, you might not have enough. So how did those rain barrels, those bioswales work? Because it really was a rainy season. Chantel, I'm curious to know what you have to say about climate change and how it impacted us this season.
Yeah, thank you. I I'm just it's weird because the climate was like severely impacting me and my immune system. And that was something that I had to navigate through, like just the changes of like it's hot and then it's cold and then it's rainy and then it's sunny. And I was 90 degrees, but now tomorrow's 50 degrees. And I'm just like, what is going on? And I think also some of the plants were also like, okay, forget this. Like, I'm gonna go to seed. And I'm like, no, don't go to seed yet. So I was seeing a lot more plants going to seed just because the fluctuation in the temperature. And they were like, okay, well, it's cold. So I'm gonna put all my energy into reproduction. And then the next day is 90 degrees, you know? And so yeah, it was a lot of issues with that. I think I also saw uptick of powdery mildew. We usually don't get powdery mildew at the spaces, but it was just very, very wet. Definitely have to incorporate more ground cover for next season just because of the wetness, and just because of these different pests and these different diseases that are popping up due to the rain.
Mm-hmm. Please forgive me if I'm mispronouncing anyone's name, and please, by all means, names are important to represent who we are, and we 100% respect them in this space. Please don't hesitate to unmute to correct Chantel or I, and please also be reminded that as we will hold all of you to the community agreements, please feel free to hold us to the community agreements. I want to uplift that I think it's pronounced Tamar was asking how did the rain this summer affect the plants? So in addition to everything that Chantel shared about the plants were cold after rains and we saw an increase in powdery mildew, we also saw in some spaces that the tremendous downpours were actually drowning the roots. The rain was also causing confusion because there was so much flooding. And to Chantel's point, after every rain comes wind and cold. And then when you have rain, flooding, wind, cold, and then it's between 90 and 96 degrees for a week straight, plants are bolting, which just means they think it's the end of the season. So they're seeding or they're overgrowing. And there's just confusion in the spaces. So it was tremendous. I think Cherian or Sherian is sharing that perhaps because of weather, maybe their after school program was closed. I want to share that that's another way that the weather was impacting us because when there was significant AQI challenges and significant rain or significant heat, we actually had to close the spaces. There were some times when it was so hot, we couldn't even get there. And we had to tell volunteers and team members, please fall back because safety first and always. Unfortunately, we can't ask you to come out when it's flooding. We can't ask you to come out when it's extreme heat. And you might not even be able to come out because, like I said, I have asthma and there were tremendous transportation issues caused by this. So there are just so many ways that the climate and the weather was impacting the space. Next slide, please. When we talk about preparing for winter, it's important to know that we must have a crop plan, not just for winter, but we must have a crop plan for all seasons. Chantel is going to go ahead and lead us off on what it means to have a crop plan specifically for winter.
Yes, thank you so much, Dee. And so when we think about a crop plan, I know folks are primarily using them in the spring. It's the beginning of the season. It's so exciting. You got all these plants, and you're like, where am I going to put all these plants, right? But crop plans are also essential at the end of the season, just for you to be able to take notes. Like I said, one of our plants had powdery mildew. That's on my crop plan, right? For us to figure out, what did well, what didn't do well, so we can visualize what crop rotation will look like for next season. And if you are in a set space for a certain period of time, you'll have, crop plans from the beginning, hopefully from the beginning of your space up until now. And so you'll be able to actually see a visual picture of what the crop plan looked like over seasons and what did well and what didn't, and you can see for what reasons, right? Crop plans also help us to identify different pests, get in front of plant diseases, right? And so, like I was saying, I'm putting down that, in bed 5, there was powdery mildew because that's going to influence the next crop that I put in there in the spring. So that way I'm not going to put a leafy green in that bed for next spring, because then they'll be more susceptible to getting powdery mildew. So these are some of the ways that crop plans can help you to kind of mitigate some of the issues in the spring, so that way you don't have to deal with it all spring and all summer into the fall, right? Crop plans also help us to identify, what community members want, like what went so fast that you couldn't even keep track of it. I know for us, it's always collard greens. Folks that came by and was like, where's the cilantro? The cilantro was done early. So now I know that I need to do another succession. I had to do a spring planting and I had to do a summer planting for cilantro because people want cilantro at the end of the season, right? Um, and it's always good to update your crop plan before you harvest, before you remove anything out of the beds. I know you think that you're going to remember, but you're not, right? And so it's always great, because also, if you update your crop plan before you remove things out of the beds, you can also document what are some unwanted things that are coming up in your beds. I know for us, we had a real issue with bindweed this spring and some this season. And so that's something I'll put on my crop plan, like bindweed in bed 8 and bed 9. So that way I can plant something else that's going to mitigate that unwanted weed from coming up in the beds. Right. And I'm saying unwanted weeds because some of the weeds I like. So we had like some mugwort that came up. I was excited about that. I was talking to people about how to use mugwort. But anyways, so these are some of the ways that crop plans can really support you for the fall into the next season. And this is a great way to get yourself started thinking about, what are things going to look like, and how can you help to mitigate some of the issues that you might have experienced this season.
We talked pretty extensively about the benefits of crop planning, but we actually omitted the biggest benefit of a crop plan, and that's just simply so that you know where things are. When you're establishing your crop plan, please write it down. Whether it's in your phone that you then send that email to your garden team and then you then transcribe later, please always keep a record of your crop plan. The reality is that people move on from gardens. They get married and move away or otherwise. And it's important to have that written document for the succession and success of your actual space. This is especially important when you have maybe large acreages or you're managing multiple spaces. And sometimes we can just simply, because we're human, get things confused or have things out of order. But when you have your crop plan, you have your living document so that you always know what the plan is. Another great thing about crop plans, when you're taking notes of what worked and what didn't, you can take those notes of what actually surprised you. In the instance of the Castle Hill Roxanne Reed Memorial Garden, which is what you're looking at here, Chantel and I noticed that catnip this season was really living her best life. She was really taking over entire beds. And the community really responded to it. So it worked out well and it was a great pest management controller. But it was definitely something that we noticed and we haven't yet figured out, was it due to climate change? Because Castle Hill was actually experiencing microclimates of rain and extreme sun. But it's also great to just make minor notes or code keys or legends on your crop plan so you can keep track of your growing season. Next slide.
Yeah, so this is just an example of what a crop plan can look like. Yours can look like whatever. It can be, notes in your phone. You can draw it out. This is just if you want to get super technical and you want to have like, this side is where the building is, and then this side is where the community is. So you can really like center yourself and like have some directional points. So that way, if anybody is looking at your crop plan, they know exactly what they're looking at. It's not just like a bunch of boxes. They know the orientation. But this is a way for you to think about like, what's in the bed. I got some notes here. The raspberries didn't do good. We put the canes in the beds, but I think the squirrels took them. And so we had pole beans. The pole beans did okay. We had a late harvest on nasturtiums. They did really well, but people didn't really like them in the community. So, that might influence whether or not I grow them again in the space. Also put some notes about carrot seeds that we were able to save. We only got a small harvest from the eggplant. That's something to note. So I might not get that same variety, or I might not get from that same producer that I got that year. And another note, request for more cilantro. So this is going to help me as I go into the next season, because some of this stuff, like I would have forgot if I didn't write it down. So I just wanted to show you all so that way you have a reference so you can know, like, write this stuff down, even if you think it's insignificant, even if you think, oh, well, I'll remember it, write it down. So that way, if you are not able to be present for next season, you can pass this on to someone else and they have the adequate notes to actually plant in the space.
We also encourage you to be as detailed as possible with your crop plan. Whether your crop plan is handwritten or you're using garden software like Canva or Gardenia, we do encourage you to put actual physical markers or indicate physical markers on your crop plan. As you see, we have building at the top of our crop plan because there's an actual building there. We have the community center to the right, and we also have a direction here where we have north, and that's important because we all learn differently. We all take direction differently. And using ourselves as an example, I am a visual global thinker. Chantel is an analytical thinker. So you want to think about not only learning capabilities, but you want to make your crop plan as well as your space as inviting, as user friendly that it can be for your volunteers, your other fellow gardeners, for your community members and your residents who are navigating your beds and helping with weeding, watering, and planting. So where possible, also too, we've got Castle Hill Garden. On the name of the plan, we've got the season that this crop plan was created. So where possible, you be as elaborative and inclusive as you can with your crop plan. We like to use color coding. Just do things so that it is descriptive and inclusive for all. Next slide.
And so your crop plan, so at this point you have looked through your beds, you thought about all the different things, you're thinking about what's going to be in your crop plan, right? And so thinking about soil is going to help to influence, what's going to happen over winter, but then also what are you actually going to do in your beds for spring and next season, right? And so that's why we put this slide talking about soil remediation, because soil is the foundation of everything that you're doing. So you want to make sure that you're testing your soil and that you're evaluating what is the soil saying, right? What is the texture? What does it feel like? Is it sandy? Is it clay? Is it really sticky? Is it super wet? Figuring out what the pH level is. And we have like a little DIY thing, but also like we also have some resources if you guys want to get free soil testing done, right? And so these things are going to help you before you do anything, before you do any cover crops, before you kind of figure out, oh, I want to do this or I want to do that. The soil testing is going to allow you to have some of that data that's going to drive the type of cover crops or the ground cover or whatever you want to implement for overwinter, right? Or even if you want to continue to grow overwinter, this soil remediation is going to help you to do that. And so soil testing, it also helps like thinking about, do you have too much of something, right? Because I know we were talking before about like DK and I were talking before about composting, right? And there was like a professor that was talking about compost bombing, and what that means is like when you dump a whole bunch of compost on the bed and they're like, oh, this is so great, I have all this great compost, but then sometimes it can be too much of a good thing, right? And so evaluating how much of something are you actually putting in the bed, and is it actually beneficial or is it harmful for your beds?
It's important to note that in any green space, whether you're growing flowers, herbs, or hardy crops, your beds, or if you're growing in ground, they're exhausted by the time we get to the end of the season. They've literally given all that they can give, and the soil just can't give anymore. And yet we're asking it to dig deep and give one more time during the winter months. Soil remediation and soil evaluation is your chance to really just prepare your soil to be out in the world, as they say, for this next most traumatic season of winter. When Chantel was talking about the role of compost, I think about how often we get requests to come look at soil because gardeners don't understand they did everything right when it came to soil, and it still came out epically wrong. And as a master composter, and Chantel is extremely experienced in soil, the first thing that we can see is that, again, they gave too much of a good thing. And the compost is actually so concentrated, it's burning the roots. So soil remediation is a great way to see almost immediately what's going on with the soil. Because what you don't want to do is assume that your soil is in a good place. You plant your seeds, and then a month or two, when you should be seeing a cover crop, you're not. And this could greatly impact the rest of your season as well, especially if you're growing winter foods to feed community. And it could also determine the direction that your spring season is going to go. We have a question from Lydia Z who asks, can you share more about soil testing resources? Yes, Lydia, absolutely. We have on our resource slide, Bronx River Alliance and Cornell Extension both provide free soil testing. And we don't have this on the slide, but I also just remembered that Brooklyn Botanic Garden from time to time also offers free soil testing. We do have Bronx River Alliance. I think we have Cornell Extension. We have them both listed, but I think we also have their websites. And if we don't, we can absolutely update that for you as well. Thank you, Lydia, for your question. Next slide, please. Everyone, feel free to drop your questions in the chat. And if there is anything burning that you really just need to talk about, please feel free to either raise your hand or simply type stack in the chat. Stack is just something that's used so that if more than one person would like to talk, we can call that person in the order that they wrote stack. So if at any time you would like to unmute, please just raise your hand, place stack in the chat. Either one is fine, and you're more than welcome to join the conversation. Chantel?
Yeah, so I also wanted to provide a simple soil testing recipe in case you're like, I don't want to wait for Cornell, right? I don't want to wait for Bronx and Red Lions. I don't, I could do it on my own. Just tell me how to do it, right? And so this is called is an at-home pH soil testing method. And this is going to allow you to see what the pH is looking like in your beds. And so you get a jar of soil. There's like a whole process if you want to get like a clean sample. So making sure that your tools are clean, making sure that you're choosing your sample at random. So some farmers, they will take a little bit of soil from different parts of the bed or from the ground, all around the entire space, and they'll put that in a bucket, and then they'll mix it all up, and then they'll use that soil, and that's what they will test to kind of see what's the overall pH of the bed, of the spaces. But if you want to do individual beds, you can certainly do so. It will take a little bit more time, but that's fair. So you basically just take 2 tablespoons of soil. You could put it in a bowl or a jar. You can mix it with water. You can mix it with baking soda. And then if it fizzes up, that means that it is acidic. And then you can do the same thing with vinegar. And then if it fizzes up, that means that it's alkaline. And so alkaline is like, that's kind of like where you kind of want it to be, I guess. Some people like alkaline soil. And then if it doesn't react to either, that means that the pH is neutral. And so I have some more like resources about that as well. I myself have never done this soil testing method. I usually take the soil and like test it with water to see like if it clumps up in my hand. I am observing the soil all season. I'm really just in community with the soil. So usually I just have an understanding of what the soil needs. And then I do the soil testing every 3 years. But this is a recipe that if you want to use it, if you want to experiment, I guess that's what it would be an experiment. So if you would like to experiment with your soil, this is one way to do it. And there are also a whole bunch of other tests that are available online if you want to research them and try them out.
So I want to share that I actually have used this test, and I've used a combo of the vinegar and the baking soda and a little bit of water. And it actually does work. And of the many benefits of this DIY soil testing, excuse me, is that one, it's cost effective because most homes, not all, but most homes have either baking soda or vinegar or sometimes both. And most homes also have water. I would recommend that if you are adding water or you are using vinegar, to please make sure it is room temperature. It will not be as effective if you use cold water, and it can go very left and very wrong if you use hot water. The hot water itself could actually kill some of the elements of the bacteria. It could also harm the beneficial flora in your soil bed and beneficial pollinators and other living in the soil. And one thing I will also say about vinegar and baking soda is that it's actually helpful to mitigate bacteria. So we're using natural ingredients that are not only helping us, to determine the potential problem, but also be a helpful fixer in that instance. Next slide.
Yeah. Oh, I also want to say before we move to the next slide that you might want acidic soil, right? And so sometimes we think of these things as bad things, but if you're trying to grow raspberries, if you're trying to grow blueberries, if you're trying to grow hydrangeas, you need acidic soil, right? And so this could be a way for you to determine, is my soil acidic enough to actually grow the things that I want to grow? So I just wanted to mention that as well.
Good point.
Yeah. And so, want to talk a little bit about cover crops. So cover crops, they play a tremendous role in soil restoration, right? And so we talked about all about like testing your soil. Like now you know what's going on with your soil. And now that you know what's going on with your soil, you can actually make an informed decision about what you want to do and what you want to use. And cover crops are one of the things that you can use to help remediate the soil, right? And so the roots of the cover crops are really the heroes here, right? Like they hold all the soil in place. They help to lessen soil erosion. They help from like compacting, and it's the beautiful like extensive root system where they like move carbon deep into the soil profile, and they also like help to like bring water and improve water filtration and drainage. So they're really like pulling some of the nutrients up to the top of the soil, so that way when you plant your little baby carrots and the stuff that you want to eat, is going to actually be able to access those nutrients a little bit easier, because you had these beautiful expansive roots that were pulling all of those nutrients up and helping the soil not to be so compacted. And so we want to talk a little bit about some non-edible cover crops. I will say that I have omitted some cover crops that are on my naughty list. Hairy vetch is one of them that I have omitted from this list. So just in case.
Tell everybody why you omitted it.
Yeah, so I omitted hairy vetch, especially for raised beds, because it's very difficult to pull out and it's very labor intensive. Also, it can get really thick and really tall, and just it's like a very strong plant. Even when you're trying to like cut them, it can be really thick and hard to cut. And so sometimes, you know, at certain spaces we have a large senior population, or we're working with kids and we want to start up the garden in the spring. It is so labor intensive to have them try to come and chop up hairy vetch that it just makes the experience very unpleasant for me and for others. So for that reason, I do not like to use hairy vetch. But I know some people, they are growing in ground, and you might not have that issue, but that is why I have omitted it from this list. But the ones that I have put are ones that I love and that have worked very well. Cow peas, field peas, clover, red and white clover, buckwheat is beautiful. I love using oats, and sometimes we'll even do like a mix of all of these different things together if we want to get, you know, if we want nitrogen fixing, if we want the phosphorus, if we want potassium, if we wanted to, you know, suppress all the weeds, we just put it all together and make a big cover crop mix. So that's why sometimes you'll see like big mixes, or you might see clover and field peas together, or you might see cow peas and buckwheat together, oats and clover together. So it's because people want those different combinations of what the actual cover crops can do for the soil.
We also want to point out that clover, whether it be general clover, red clover, or white clover, is most often used as the flooring in high tunnels. And that is because, one, it just looks aesthetically pleasing. Two, it can help maintain temperature in high tunnels. It can also help mitigate moisture. And this might sound very simple, but it could also just help with footing. Sometimes when you put gravel or wood chips in a high tunnel, while it does help control temperature, it can just be difficult to step on. And we're going to talk more about high tunnels a little later in the presentation.
Yeah. And so I also wanted to add, we also wanted to add some edible cover crops as well, because, you know, clover is very beautiful to look at, but you can't eat it, right? And as a hungry girl in a hungry world, right, we got to eat. And so it's beautiful to grow something that has a dual purpose. It is going to do the nitrogen fixing and all the other mineral fixings, but you could still eat it. So we have some forage radish, which is like basically it looks like the oh man, the daikon radish, which is like the big white ones, and you just pull them up and then you could just eat like the actual radish. So that's really good. Mustard greens, I love mustard greens. I love introducing people to mustard. One thing I will say about mustard is that you shouldn't let it go to seed if you use it as a cover crop. And then also anywhere that you use it as a cover crop, you shouldn't put brassicas there. So you shouldn't put any leafy greens in that particular bed or that area for the next season. So that's one thing to like note about the mustard greens. Also, you could do turnips, you could do wheat. Those you could let go to seed if you want to harvest wheat. You could do garlic. I love doing garlic. Community members are always so happy to get garlic in the summer. You could do barley. You could also do lamb's quarter. I know people don't usually think about lamb's quarter as edible, but it is edible. It does have some medicinal properties to it, and it's native, so that's a beautiful thing as well. Purslane, I love doing purslane. Purslane is awesome. A lot of people and a lot of different global communities use purslane. They stew it, they saute it, they use it in soups. They just do everything with purslane. That one is really cool. And then also you could use mint. Mint is a dramatic accumulator. It is going to spread everywhere, and it's also going to be beautiful and fragrant. So yeah.
So a few things to note. Lamb's quarter is traditionally used in Asian cooking. It makes a wonderful alternative to basil when you are making pesto. It's akin to maybe cooking or sauteing spinach. One thing that's important to note about purslane is that as an herb, as with all herbs, we do encourage you to consult with your doctor, especially if you are taking other medications that may conflict with possible herbs. And this is especially true with purslane, of which if you are pregnant, you should definitely consult your doctor before using purslane. We also want to take a moment to talk about mint just a little bit more in depth because we often get the question, isn't mint an invasive weed? And the answer is 100%. But the reason it works as a weed is because mint, and there are so many classifications of mint in that actual family, mint has a very assertive personality. And mint can actually allay other weeds from trying to pop up and take over your bed because mint in itself is so assertive. We also want to uplift and acknowledge that for cultural reasons, for faith-based reasons, and because we all come from different backgrounds, Chantel and I are not using the word invasive negatively. As an herbalist myself, invasives are actually welcome because they're used culturally and spiritually as earth medicine and for teas. So we encourage you to please always remember that language matters, and even the term invasive can be used for positivity and good. Chantel?
Yes. And so I also wanted to provide some context for folks who are like, well, I don't want to do cover cropping, right? If I don't want to do cover crop, I don't want to buy the seeds. I know you talk about purslane and you talk about lamb's quarter. I don't want it, right? So what else can you do, right, to support the soil over winter? So you can do tarping. I think tarping is really cool. A lot of farmers use tarping. So they use a black plastic, and they put it over the soil and they put it in between plantings. And so what that basically does, it just darkens. It's like a cover over your head. You know when you're in bed and you just put the cover over your head and you feel so warm and sleepy and you're just dormant. That's what you're doing for all the microbes and all of the beneficial bacteria that's in your soil. You're just blanketing them. And also, what it's doing, because you don't have that light, you're not allowing for any weeds to pop up. Any weeds will automatically be suppressed. If there are any additional cover crop seeds that are in that bed, they will be terminated. And then also that tarp is going to be insulated. Remember, I said it's like a cover. So it's keeping you nice and warm. So it's going to control that soil moisture, and it's going to make sure that that soil is nice and warm. And you'll actually be able to plant in the bed sooner with the tarping method because the bed has just been kind of like warmed and snuggled all winter. So that is a good possibility if you want to just do tarping instead of doing cover cropping. The other thing you can do is you can use mulch. A lot of people, they just mulch the whole bed. They just throw mulch on the whole thing, right? And so mulch can look like a combination of compost, wood chips, cardboard. Some farmers using seaweed. We getting creative out here, right? And so all of this is to, suppress the weeds, to reduce water loss, to reduce the soil erosion and compaction, and also just protect from harsh elements. So like you want to make sure that that soil is protected. Anything that you still have growing, I like to use the mulch method if I still have things that are growing in the beds because it's going to protect them from the wind, other things. It's just going to be like a nice stabilizer for the plants that are in the beds. And then another method you can do, which is called a chop and drop. So a chop and drop is essentially where you take the plants that you already have and you just chop them at the base, and then you use those leaves and the stems as a ground cover. So that could be really cool because then you could use the existing stuff that you already have in your beds as your ground cover, right? Or as your cover crop. And so that also helps with weed suppression. Those things, they break down, it creates biomass, and it also is going to help to control soil moisture because it's going to act as a layer over your soil. So it's like a plant blanket. The other one is a plastic blanket. The chop and drop is a plant blanket. So that's a cool way to kind of think about these different options that you have.
It's very important to keep in mind that all three of these are going to help regulate soil temperature and protect the soil from sun, rain, and wind. And folks might not think that sun is an issue in the wintertime, but it actually is. And it can contribute, even in winter, to overheating or overexposure of light. So mulching, chop and drop, or tarping your soil are just essential aspects for weed suppression, but also temperature control. And mulching, just like soil kits, of which I dropped in the chat, mulch is always something that perhaps can be offered through free giveaways from local area community partners like Grow NYC, Bronx Green Up at NYBG, New York Restoration Project, and others. So please always be on the lookout for perhaps community partner giveaways, not only just for mulch and soil tests, soil testing equipment, but also other essential maybe tools and seeds that you might use to benefit your garden.
Yes. And now we're gonna go for the people that are like, I want to keep growing, right? And so and so if you have a space and you want to continue growing in your space, you're like, hey, that cover crop thing you was talking about is fine, but we need to eat over here. And there's a very specific things that we need to eat, right? And so here we have just developed a small planting chart of some of the things that are going to grow really well in the city. And from this, you can kind of have your pick of the litter of like what it is that you would like to grow. So we got spinach, we got cabbage, we got a lot of greens in here, bok choy. We have sweet potatoes, carrots, parsnip, garlic, of course. That way you could pull those up in the spring and the summer, radishes, kale, turnips. We got some more mint in here. We got the catnip because she gonna keep going. We got broccoli. If you want to do some broccoli, broccoli does really well in the fall, in the winter time. Most people like to grow broccoli in the summer, but they just get overheated so fast. So you might get a better crop of broccoli if you plant it in the fall and in a winter crop. And then we got our herb beds that DK is going to really go into, talking more about what it looks like to grow herbs in the fall and winter.
Mm-hmm. So a few things to note when we talk about fall and winter planting. One, broccoli is in the brassica family along with collards, and collards grow exceptionally well in winter time. So when you want to not only feed communities, but you want to feed in abundance, broccoli and collards are those two go-tos that you really want to consider. And to Chantel's point, because when we experience those microclimates and it's hot and then it's cold and then it's rainy, sometimes our plants will bolt and get confused and think that it's time to end the season and they'll start to seed. Collards and broccoli do especially well because usually, no, let me take that back. I don't want to make that assumption, but we are still experiencing more cold in the wintertime than not, even though the temperatures might not be as cold, we are still experiencing consistent cold. So broccoli and collards are going to do well in those environments. We also want to point out that these specific recommendations that we've made according to this crop plan, we pattern them off of potential companion planting. And the easiest tip that I always give growers about companion planting, and companion planting is just a fancy term that means it's going to get along, it's going to support each other and grow well in the bed, is that for those like myself that sometimes struggle to remember what companions grow well, think about if it is a companion on your plate and it tastes good together harmoniously, chances are it's going to be harmonious in the actual garden bed as well. When we talk about herbs, we have ours here laid out of sage, thyme, and oregano together as one herb bed. And we have calendula, poppy, and primrose that are herbs that also flower in another. But we do encourage you, oh, and we also have mint. We also encourage you to consider companion planting with herbs so that your beds have balance. This will also help with pest mitigation because mint is a tremendous ally against winter insects. And believe it or not, because of climate change, mosquitoes. I don't know if anyone has ever said, do I have a mosquito bite in the wintertime? You absolutely do. Because we've been seeing over the years with climate change and these microclimates, when it's December and all of a sudden it's 60 degrees, but then by the end of the month, now we're in the 30s, mosquitoes, pests, birds, pollinators, they're feeling this shift as well. And mint is a great mitigator for mosquitoes. Next slide.
Yeah, we also want to highlight some natives that you might want to think about growing, right? And so I love aster, so that's my first girl that's up here. Also in the aster families, goldenrod, which has beautiful medicinal properties, also just very beautiful pollinator inviter. Milkweed, which is going to support with the butterflies, support with bees, just getting those pollinators into the space. Dandelion. I know some people are like, girl, why you put dandelion up here? But don't discount my girl Dandelion because she be out here feeding folks. People be out here eating dandelion and using it for medicinal properties, as well as the red dead nettle, which also has a lot of medicinal properties. And I think mint is our favorite girl because we keep bringing her up. So mint as well for a native. And so these different natives, think about how you can incorporate them into your crop plan, and think about what they would look like either being in beds or just in the space as ornamentals, and how you can pull more pollinators into your space. I know for sure milkweed, it does like to be sown in the winter so we can get that cold stratification so we can actually pop up in the spring. So some of these stuff you can plant right now, even though you're not going to see them actually start to grow and bloom until the springtime. And I see we got folks in the chat. DK, what's going on in the chat?
So I'm actually Also putting the inner herbalist in me is always going to shout out what herbs actually do and the importance of herb medicine. So I'm just letting folks know not only are our New York natives beautiful and an alternative to cover cropping, they have great medicinal purposes and capabilities. I'm thinking as I look at the beautiful dandelion, I think of culturally some community residents and gardeners that we have in the Bronx who actually collect the dandelion flowers to fry them. They put them in a light batter, they fry them, and they're delicious to actually eat with sauces. I'm thinking about how when I go to the garden, actually on Friday, I'm gonna harvest some goldenrod to make soda. I think about how I use dead nettle to help with winter allergies. And the number one stunner, mint, is always gonna come through for tea. Chantel, how are you using cover crops, native cover crops to
Well,
eat?
to eat, I think like I haven't really, I mean, definitely meant for the tea. I have had a dead nettle tea, which was really good, and I mixed it with like I'm looking at my tea bags over here. I mixed it with like some lemon balm and it had like a nice, beautiful aroma to it. I haven't tried the deep fried dandelion, so we should make that together. And I'm always super excited for aster. There's like aster growing near my apartment. It's going to seed. It hasn't fully seeded yet. And I was like, ooh, I'm keeping my eye on you because when I see those seeds, I'm gonna be seed keeping the aster by Highland. So yeah, super excited for that.
Nice. As
Okay.
we go into the next slide to talk about season extension continued, and we talk about cold frames, row cover, high tunnels, and greenhouses. We want to respect your time, and we see that we are coming on the 6:10 timing mark.
Mhm.
So we are going to shift to a more summation format so that we can leave time for questions and input. But we do want to talk about the benefits of cold frames versus row cover. As you can see here, there are quite a few pros and cons. I know from myself, I am 100% a fan of both. And mainly because they just promote for season extension. What I like about cold frames is that they are pretty sturdy and they're reliable. They're also not nearly as costly as high tunnels and greenhouses, but the aspect of cold frames that I like the most is that they're affordable and they're easy to put together. One of the main challenges of a cold frame can be that they don't really, first of all, you have to have the space for a cold frame. And additionally, they can at times be difficult to regulate temperature. When it comes to row cover, like a cold frame, I really appreciate that they're a low cost option. And one of the great things about cold frames and row covers is that they don't require electricity, which can increase your costs on the farm. And maybe some spaces, depending on your designation, or if you're in a particular partnership, you might not be able to have electricity. So cold frames and row cover are great ways to trap heat just from the sun. But conversely, because we keep talking about climate, if you're not getting a lot of sun, this can greatly affect the heat that your cold frame and row cover might be able to trap, and it could actually affect what you're growing. Both actually also protect your crops from insects, bugs, and larger animals, which is very helpful. But the challenge with row cover is that unfortunately, when it rains and when it's windy, it might require you to adjust it and size it more, which can be quite an annoyance or just inconvenient. Chantel, do you have a preference?
Yes, I really like the cold frames. There is like a cost associated with the startup, but I feel like over a period of time they just hold up a little bit better. Also, working with some of our groups, a lot of the elder population, they always complain to me about the road cover, like, oh, it flew off. So you have to like weigh it down with rocks, and it requires a lot of upkeep. Also just like taking the road cover off, like folks like will feel like, oh, like I have to take the road cover off to water. You don't necessarily have to, but most people do. Like they remove the road cover, right? And so it just creates a more of like an additional labor versus some of the cold frames. You could just like lift it up and it's like, oh, okay. And also I think it's just very like aesthetically pleasing as well. It looks very nice. And also you could do your own starts in a cold frame a little bit easier than you would be able to do in a roll cover. So I think for me, I really like cold frames. If it was up to me, it would be cold frames in every garden. But to each his own.
I like cold frames and row cover. Next slide, please. But I really, really like high tunnels and greenhouses. These are the go-tos for many spaces when it comes to season extension because unlike row cover and cold frames, we are able to not only extend our season, our growing season, but we're actually able to grow those more tropical based desired herbs and hardier crops that we just might be desirous of. We've listed here some pros and cons for both. What I do want to point out is that, again, greenhouses and high tunnels, like cold frames and row cover, don't require electricity. You can put electrical heaters in them, but they're not required. One of the benefits of a high tunnel is that it's movable and changeable. So that is to say, it's not a permanent structure. You can actually move it. One of the cons is that it does require maintenance year round. You want to be careful if you have heavy snow because the rooftop can cave in. And spacing can be an issue when you're either establishing it or if you decide to move it. When it comes to a greenhouse, this is a great opportunity for propagation to start your herbs, your flowers, and your crops. But the challenge with greenhouses is that they can be tremendously expensive because many greenhouses are oftentimes very expensive plastics for durability or glass. And another challenge with greenhouses is that they are actually not movable and more permanent in space. High tunnels and greenhouses can vary in cost, but the majority of the time, they do vacillate from moderate to higher costs. Chantel?
Yeah, agreed. I think high tunnels have been getting a lot of love in the farming community recently. And greenhouses, they just require having electricity is a big barrier for a lot of people. And so I know a lot of folks have done like mini greenhouses that kind of go over the beds that mimic cold frames. And so like if you want a greenhouse but you can't afford one, you should do a high tunnel or a cold frame. And so closing out the season, this is going to look like shoring up your messaging, making sure you're communicating with folks, letting people know when's the last day of harvest, what are last workshops that you're having, any volunteering events that you want to have to close out the season. Also, what are the winter hours? If you're still growing, if you're still planting, like when can folks actually come by to harvest or get food? If you have any other resources, if you're connecting them to any other workshops or things that are going on, winter programming, right? You're going to want to be able to get that messaging out. And then also just, solidifying relationships, like if community partners or certain partnerships went really well this season, like extending your thanks and like going to them and being like, hey, this went really well this season. And same thing for things that might not have went really well. Like, hey, I think this is ways that we can like solidify our partnership a little bit more and for things to go a little bit smoother for the next upcoming season. So really like getting in on that communication now that you have some rest period.
When we talk about closing out the season, it's particularly important that we maintain messaging and communication with our volunteers, with our staff, and with our community partners, simply because just because the season has ended, it doesn't mean that the space isn't still quite active. And that is to say that you want those community partners, you want those volunteers who will from time to time just stop by the garden or the farm just to see how it's doing, just so that you can know, hey, that snow is really building up on the high tunnel. You need to get over here and do something about it. Hey, I noticed that there was water coming from the garden and I know that we turned off the water and disconnected the hose. Hey, I happen to notice that there's a tremendous trash buildup in the garden and I know that that's not coming from volunteers because the space is closed. So you definitely want those watchful eyes, not in a surveillance kind of way, but just in a helpful kind of way. We also want to pay close attention at the end of season to saving our seeds. We want to keep those seeds that were really beneficial and produced great herbs and crops because we're going to want to grow them the next season. When we're closing out, at the end of our season, it's very important that we invest in proper tool care and storage. Tools can be hard to acquire because they can just be expensive. We're still experiencing equipment and labor shortages due to the earlier days of the pandemic. And you really, really, really want to properly process, store, and dry and clean and just keep your tools safe over winter. And then again, those staffing and site check-ins, just keep in contact with people who are in close proximity of the garden so that you can just understand how the garden or farm is doing over the season. Next slide, please. When we're talking about winterizing, it's important that we winterize all spaces in the garden. And for those who have beehives, that absolutely includes your bees too. When you're preparing for winter, plan in advance when your last honey extraction for the season is going to be. This is not something you want to leave to the last minute because with these microclimates and climate changing, we can experience hot weather in October. And then before you know it, in December, it's close to 35, 40 degrees and the bees are struggling. Make sure you have an active plan to winterize your hive. And that actually starts with planning your honey extraction. You want to make sure that you've done your mite inspection. You want to make sure that you've checked the temperature in the hive. You want to make sure that the bees have enough to eat over the winter, because if they don't, they're possibly going to try to leave the hive. And then unfortunately, they'll freeze to death. And this is going to not only affect the temperature and safety in the hive, but it's going to affect their honey output for the following season. Consult a local beekeeper if you're not sure of how to insulate or cover your hives. And again, plan regular check-ins with community partners who might be able to stop by the farm or garden space to just simply tell you, hey, you need to stop by, you need to check on the bees. Next slide. We've done all this work. We've taken our steps to plan for our end of season, and we've harvested all of this great produce, all of these wonderful herbs and these fruits. Here are just a few recommendations of what you might be interested in doing with your harvest and saving your harvest for winter. We've got a few recommendations here when it comes to drying, freezing, and pickling. And we find in our experience that these seem to be the most common and popular options in the spaces that we steward, but we encourage you to keep experimenting, explore things you haven't tried before, and see what works for you. I would encourage you to stay tuned for a blog post from us at Gardens at NYCHA regarding recipes and more information regarding preserving your harvest. And as a part of our resource guide, we do have some recommended reading materials of cookbooks that actually talk about drying, freezing, preserving, pickling, and so on.
Right. And as you get into your groove of doing these things, don't forget who put you on and send a jar our way. Um, And as DK said in the beginning of the session, we're talking a lot about winter, but then spring rolls right around, right? So how can you get prepared? All of this is to prepare you for the spring and a plan to succeed. So thinking about what does the year look like? When do you want to start planning all of this stuff out, right? Asking your community to weigh in on the crop plan. Our community is always telling us, grow more of this, grow more of that. And we love that because it gives us an idea of what people are looking for so that way we're not growing things that people are not going to eat, right? Thinking about pests, right? What pests did you have? What diseases did you have? How can you bring some of those beneficial bugs into the garden space that are going to help to mitigate some of those pests? How can you bring some of those herbs into the space that are going to help to mitigate some of those diseases, right? And so those things are going to help you to identify what crops, what flowers, what herbs, and what native plants you want to use for next season. And then also thinking about what is programming going to look like. Are you going to have one workshop a month? Are you going to do one workshop a quarter? Whatever that plan is, to like be intentional about that and make it be reasonable. Like, don't say I'm going to do a workshop every week. If you got a full-time job and you're doing the garden on the side, don't do that. You're going to burn yourself out, right? And so making sure that whatever your plan is for the upcoming season, that is actually reasonable and it's doable and you can commit to it, right? And then also talking to your partners, right? Seeing like, hey, what stuff can we pre-plan ahead of schedule? What are some volunteer days that you guys want to come out? Every corporate partner wants to come out on Earth Day, right? So how can you maximize on Earth Day in the wintertime so you can actually plan a really robust offering and be able to get a whole bunch of folks out into the space to be able to do some of that work that maybe you can't, that other community members can't support with at that time.
Next slide, please. We talked a lot of robust information about preparing for winter essentials. But here are some key things to remember. When we fail to plan, we plan to fail. Please always just simply have a plan. What's going to be your blueprint, not just going into winter, but going into every season? Communicate. And this lends into keeping a record and asking for help. Please don't be a garden hero and be on a fast track to exhaustion by trying to do all of this by yourself. Volunteers are always excited and ready to learn more about garden practices. And when we communicate that we need help, we don't have to do it all by ourselves. Volunteers are also excited when we plan end of season harvests. And these are great ways to not only clear the beds, but prepare the beds for that winter planning that we talked about. Please always source responsibly. Trust and know your sources, whether it be for your soil testing, your seed companies, for your winter cropping seeds, or other. You want to set your excuse me. You want to set yourself up for success, and you want to be able to trust your space partners. Please be mindful of your timing and your timelines. Leave room to adjust. And most importantly, leave room to make mistakes and have to start over or even plan again. We can do everything right and things still come out epically wrong, and that's okay. Just plan time for that. Keep experimenting, and most of all, have fun. If we're going to do all this, we want them to at least be spaces that we want to be in. Next slide, please. And always make time for rest. We don't talk about rest often enough. Next slide, please. When we rest, we must make time for holistic wellness. And we're talking about mental and physical wellness. I personally want to be that intergenerational farmer that's doing this for many, many years to come. And the only reason or way that I'm gonna be able to do that is if I really focus on rest. Please stay hydrated, drink water, listen and tap into your body. If you're experiencing headaches or symptoms of dehydration, please just stop and drink specifically water. Have balance in your wellness regimen. Too much of one thing in the garden can be harmful, and we apply that to our mental and physical health as well. Communicate your boundaries and your capacity with your garden team members, and just know that we are stronger when we lift together than when we lift separately. Next slide, please. We've talked a lot about winter practices, and we'd like to offer some opportunities to actually practice what we've talked about. We have 3 opportunities here at our Gardens at NYCHA Castle Hill spaces, our Bushwick space, and our Pelham Parkway space, of which we invite you to join us to practice preparing for winter. Volunteering with us at Gardens at NYCHA does not require registration, and it is free and open to all communities. Next slide, please. We have some information about wanting to learn more. These are some things that we talked about in 2023 that community members told us that they wanted to have more of in 2024. Next slide, please. And we'd now like to turn the floor over to any burning questions. We do want to respect your time, and we do understand that it is 6:31. But if anyone would like to come off mute, please feel free to do so. And for those who are not able to stay longer, we thank you for your time and for coming. We will be emailing out this deck to attendees who came tonight. Chantel, you can go ahead and show the resources and recommended reading. Again, if anybody would like to come off mute, feel free to do so, but you will have access to these additional resources and recommended reading when we send out the slide deck. And our last is going to be how to keep in contact with each other. Chantel and I are always excited about keeping the conversation going, and we understand that this was a lot of information to digest in one sitting. We also understand that when we talk about food, that sometimes we can unearth situations that might tap into trauma or histories or stories. So we also uplift you and support you in that way as well.
Beautiful. So we want to thank everyone for coming out and for joining us, for learning more about preparing for winter. And we are super excited to see any of you if you decide to come out to the spaces and actually get your hands in the soil and get some practice on what it looks like to prepare for winter.
I don't see any hands, so we're actually going to say good night and thank you for joining us. Good night.